Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Dave. All right, so I think that small technical difficulty on our end here, but I'll fix now. So hi, welcome to the holiday tadpole pack tasting. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. My voice has been in and out a lot today, so I'm going to be having Kelby and Megs do even more of the talking than they normally do. But we're very excited to see you here. And I imagine there's going to be a couple of people joining late, but since I think everyone's kind of busy this time of year, we'll probably go ahead and get started. And since this is like really and truly Kelby's tasting, I'm going to let him kind of take it from here.
Thank you, Katie. Happy holidays, everyone. I've come with the appropriate gear for the evening. We've got a fun lineup of wines tonight. A 4-pack of kind of sampling across the KJR lineup. So a real cross section, including a couple of, I suppose actually 3 of the 4 are relatively rare wines at this point. So being able to pick them up both as tadpoles, but then after the fact as 750s is something that's pretty special for this club. So I'm going to quickly have Megs unmute herself and say hi before we dive into it. Assistant winemaker extraordinaire.
Hello. How is everyone tonight?
Doing great.
We're great.
And we obviously have Dave, well, down in the corner for me, but founding winemaker, owner of Red Newt. And who I caught in the middle of a bite. Sorry, Dave. And then Katie and also Heather up in the together right at the tasting room. So, I think we will probably start with the 2016 dry Riesling. I was kind of going back and forth over what order we would want to taste in, but I think we'll do age before beauty in this instance, and go with the oldest of the 4 wines. So. Let me crack this open. And we'll get going. So right from the start with the KJR lineup, I feel like understandably the rosé is what people maybe most often think of in this range. I mean, both the biggest SKU, but also the wine that is probably the most widely known. But right from the beginning, it launched with the rosé, the dry Riesling, and a Cabernet Franc. So the rosé kind of got the first filling and was the first wine out of the gates, so people think of it. But that first vintage in 2013, we did have all 3. The Riesling has always been maybe one of my favorite things to talk about in this lineup. It kind of explains why the KJR wines exist, which is to say that they've always been a chance for me to make expressions of wine that wouldn't have maybe naturally fit within the Red Newt umbrella. I think it's, I always say when I took over the winemaking at Red Newt, I was taking over a fantastic winemaking program that had a great history, had a real style to it. You can't just kind of like pull the rug out from under that and upend things, nor would I want to. So as important as it was for me to keep the sort of like mainline Red Newt wines stylistically coherent, there were things that I brought into the cellar, different ideas, different styles that I liked working with that I wanted to kind of take a crack at. And those have always been generally what sits into the KJR lineup. So having a Riesling might seem a little bit head scratching, right? Like Red Newt does plenty of Riesling. What makes this Riesling different? Why would this be so esoteric that it wouldn't be a natural fit for the Red Newt lineup at the time? Which is a great question. And so I don't dominate all the talking. I'm going to kick it to Megs to talk about.
Oh yeah, I'll just talk about the stylistic choices you make for Rieslings. It's not a big deal. No, I think the Riesling in particular under the KJR lineup, we call Aussie in the cellar, and it is really an ode to, like, as we've talked about in the past, kind of an Australian style Riesling, which tends to be just really racy acidity, absolutely no residual sugar to speak of, and something that a lot of times kind of when it's young comes off as what we would call kind of like smoky and reductive, which as like kind of time morphs by will open up to a little bit more kind of bright fruits and whatnot, while still having that kind of racy acidity. And so it's really an homage to a lot of Australian style Rieslings in that a lot of the ones that, I've had in the past tend to maybe not be the most appreciable wines to drink young, but are something that if you do cellar are absolutely spectacular. And I think this 2016 is really showcasing a little bit of what happens. Having tasted it myself from the beginning to the end, like it's really starting to open up and become a little bit more expressive in its own.
Yeah, I think this Aussie style is one that when it's young can be very smoky, very shut down. It can also be so acid forward. I mean, we would say kind of like lemon lime, which is, has maybe a certain charm to it, but that sort of lemon lime acid is covering up how beautiful a wine it will actually become when everything has a chance to settle down. So a few years of bottle age is just the ticket for that. I often think of this wine kind of in the same way that people talk about base wine for champagne. If you're doing traditional method sparkling, base wine is very acidic, very tight, not particularly generous in any way. And it's really that secondary process of fermenting it in the bottle and leaving it on the lees in the bottle that allow things to open up and allow the wine to kind of gain the generosity and become the wine that we want it to. Aussie style Riesling, I think, has a lot of similarities to that. I mean, we're not putting it through a second ferment in the bottle, but the amount of time we give it in the bottle before releasing it, 5 or 6 years, is really what allows the wine to soften out and kind of express itself. And I think it's saying something that this is a 2016 Riesling. Just for context, Megs, what was the 2016 vintage like?
I finally remember 2016 after so many times of not remembering. It was a drought year here in the Finger Lakes, so relatively quite warm and also very, very dry all the way through harvest, right up till I want to say it was like October 20th or something when we actually finally got some rain. But remarkably dry vintage, which if I continue, sorry, Kelby, stop me if I'm going too far, I think actually really played a great role in kind of giving us more of like what we would do with an Aussie style Riesling. So smaller grapes, thicker skins, a little bit more phenolics, a lot of like flavor potential that was coming out of that particular vintage.
And still really fresh acid in this wine for a vintage that we think of as being pretty hot. I mean, the danger with a hot vintage is that it can become a little bit almost blousy, like just a little flabby. And this wine is certainly not that. I mean, it's crafted in a way to bring out or to allow the acid to shine through, but in a really hot, dry vintage, there's no question about the sort of the pedigree of this wine and how beautifully it's aging. I think it's really showing beautifully. I mean, what is not surprising is that maybe compared to cooler vintages of this wine, this one is developing a little bit faster. It's showing that sort of like the apricot and toasty things and peach at a little bit younger of an age than a cold vintage would. That's where you're seeing the generosity of the vintage. But it's still a really tight, really nervy wine for being 6 years old at this point. How are other people finding it? Or other thoughts, I suppose?
All right, well, I'll go. Given the history going back to 2013 with this Riesling, we are currently offering in the tasting room the 2015 Riesling. And that one currently is tasting a bit younger than this one. So yeah, you're right, Kilby. That heat actually has allowed it to progress a little bit quicker in the bottle, and it's delicious.
I would echo that sentiment, actually, of all of you. This is really a beautiful wine. And thinking back, let's see, how long ago was it? 5 years when it was bottled? Very angular, very, very tight, very focused, almost jagged in some ways. But yet now it's just this a beautiful combination of voluptuous and rigid at the same time. I don't know how that happens, but it's it kind of smoothly coats a palate without losing that punch of sort of citrus acidity. It's really, really beautiful. I'm enjoying it with a couple grapes here, hummus. It's really good.
Yeah, it's like the magic of this style, and also the magic of having really good Riesling vineyard sites and Riesling terroir, which we do in the Finger Lakes. I mean, this obviously is not, I don't think you would actually mistake this for an Aussie Riesling in a blind tasting necessarily. And the goal has never been to sort of like, I don't know, photocopy Australian Riesling. It's the idea of taking this style of Aussie Riesling, this very acid forward, angular, needs time in bottle style, and kind of doing a Finger Lake spin on it, almost an homage, I suppose, which has been a lot of fun. It's been a really fascinating wine to work on over the years. Probably the only real big change that ever happened, the very first vintage of it, the 2013, came from the Tango Oaks vineyard site, just down the slope from us at Red Newt, which worked out, but was a particularly awkward and angular expression. And it did eventually come in, but it was, a little bit, a little bit more convoluted of a path to get to the finish line. So from the 14 vintage on, I think pretty much across the board, it switched over to the La Homa vineyard site across the lake, which is more generous of a vineyard site, and seems to have worked much better for this style year in and year out. At least when we get to try them. So, and
I think it's really delicious. It is very acidic, but in a nice way. It just really coats the tongue. I think it would pair very, very nicely with food.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful, it's just showing like a beautiful can do, which is kind of funny to say given this whole preamble about it being an Aussie style, but in the glass it just comes across as like a really, sorry, I'm probably jagged right now, a really beautiful Finger Lakes dry. And I think I'll have a switch over to the 2020 Gruner next. Maybe have Megs talk about it to start with. While I maybe switch my Wi-Fi connection here.
So in particular, like I am very excited that we are introducing this wine to everybody. Gruner Veltliner has often been a grape that I really loved expressions of, and I've really loved most of the wines that I've had from Gruner. Although you can have some that are a little bit like lemon watery, but like the grape itself has so much potential. And in 2020, we got the opportunity to kind of not flip over, but like had access to this Gruner Veltliner from La Homa Vineyards that we were able to work with, which was super exciting. And vineyard location wise, it's actually just upslope from the knoll. They actually almost touch each other as far as location. So vineyard site wise, we knew this was going to be something that was really, really special. And we kind of worked with a little bit of this fruit in the past for like a custom project. But this was the first time that we kind of got to take it and run with it in a direction that we wanted it to kind of move in. And I think the result was absolutely spectacular. And we're also coming off the 2020 vintage, which was like a winemaker's dream. So, the Gruner Veltliner in particular, I think is like kind of a golden child as far as like a first time attempt at making a wine.
Yeah, and like Meg said, we did have a couple of cracks at this in-house this vintage. So we had a real sense of what we wanted to do with the wine. And what that means is we didn't want to create lemon water or create, there's a lot of Gruners that also sometimes taste a lot like Sauvignon Blanc, which is totally fine, but that's a greener of Gruner. And the degree of this vineyard site, the sort of ripeness we expect from the knoll, that wasn't what we were looking for. So pretty late pick. And then from the picking, pressed off, a lot of some skin contact, a lot of leaves contact, fermented and aged, I should say, in older French barriques. So in some ways, the rare oak aged wine, I suppose, or oak aged white wine from us. But the point is that you shouldn't really be able to taste the oak, not in any overt way. It's there to kind of like flesh out the wine and to allow, especially with Gruner, to allow the white pepper to sort of come out, the savory sides of the grape. And it's another wine that at the 2020 vintage, we're coming from 16, which was hot and dry, to 2020, which was hot and not as dry, but it wasn't wet either. It was, like Meg said, it was a really a cruisy vintage in a lot of ways. And it was a good test case for us. Gruner is a weird grape in the Finger Lakes. It's probably just a weird grape in general for any number of reasons. But it really kind of stalls out when it's ripening sugar-wise. It'll get to maybe, I don't know, 11.5% potential alcohol. And then it just kind of like, it hits a flat point, a plateau. And oftentimes you see people jump and pick it then because they know it's not going up anymore. But if you're just looking at the numbers, you're missing what's happening on the vine. And when you let it hang for a couple more weeks, even if the sugar stays the same, the grapes go from a almost vivid green, it's like highlighter green at that point, to a little bit more of like a softer golden yellow. There's still like a green tinge to it. It's not as golden as I don't know, as Riesling gets, but there is a distinct change. And the sort of flavor ripeness that comes in that 2-week window is pretty profound. That's really what we're looking for in Gruner whenever we're making it. So it's a combination of a great vineyard site that lets us do that, and then some pretty smart winemaking in the cellar between all of us to let that come to the fore. And this is a wine, the 2020 was the first vintage of it under the KJR label. There's not much of it left. Katie can jump in and correct me. It basically got immediately sucked up by our distributor and disappeared around New York State in particular. But we did sit on some here at the winery so that we would have it for tastings like this and to showcase it and to talk about it as well as our own purposes. Is that fair to say, Katie?
Yes.
So is there going to be any to purchase of this?
Yes.
Okay. I was very excited when I saw it. I love
Yeah.
Gruner Veltliner.
So
Just for
there's
you, though.
actually 2 different Gruners on our website currently. So I went ahead and added late this afternoon. The 4 wines that we're trying today will be available online. They don't all look pretty, but they're all there on the website. Had some issues getting the labels to show up. But they will only be there until Friday. We're not telling anybody else that they're there except for you guys. So when you go to our online store, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see different menus you can go to, and you want to hit the KJR series, and all 4 of these plus the 3 that we would normally have available for sale will all be available online.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
If you're looking on your iPhone, that link that Katie talked about will be way at the bottom of the page to find those ones.
I'll find it.
I would be remiss. I mean, there's a small window here to purchase this wine, again, because it is pretty much sold out. But the Red Newt Gruner 2020, which is also in the store, comes from the same pedigree. The difference between the two is that the red newt bottling was done with age the same fruit source, but the red newt one was fermented with one of our favorite Austrian yeasts, which is appropriate for Gruner, and is maybe has a little bit more fruit to it. I haven't actually tasted these two side by side, the same vintage, I should say, in a little bit. But I feel like the red newt, because of that Austrian yeast, has a little bit more fruit, maybe, and is a little bit more chiseled, I would say. This bottling, the KJR one, which was done with a spontaneous ferment, but we're good at what we do, so it doesn't taste or smell funky. But that spontaneous ferment does, I would say in this instance, maybe give it a little bit more smoke and a little bit more, maybe like mouth coating mid palate weight. Not to throw a bunch of winemaking jargon, but I feel like the red newt in comparison is a little bit like crisper and tighter. But same vintage, 2020, same fruit, and both beautiful wines, just different expressions of the coin. And Heather is doing the taste test right now for confirmation.
Indeed, I am.
And as someone who's drank probably an embarrassing amount of the red newt Gruner this year, I can tell you that Kelby is like dead on. I do feel like this one's a little bit more, and I'll go with a word that Dave used earlier, a little bit more luscious in style than the red newt Gruner.
Indeed. And both.
I wouldn't say embarrassing, Katie. I mean, you have to do it for your job.
I mean, it's like research and
It's
development,
work.
right?
Yeah.
Professional development.
And Megs, please say hi to Doonan, who's popping into the screen there a couple of times.
We all saw him walk across. Yes. Say hi.
So, one question, Kelby.
Yes.
I know what foods that I would love with each of these Gruners, but what's your favorite food pairing for your Gruner?
Good question.
Because it has that slightly different flavor profile.
Yeah. Boy, and I'm trying not to be like recency bias here, what I've had recently, which is always the tough thing. I feel like, I mean, I'm going to cop out a little bit and say that I feel like it is great for something like Wiener Schnitzel or any of those sorts of like fried cutlet things. I mean, it's obviously an Austrian grape, so that's a bit of a cheat code to say. But I would say even more so than Riesling, because this Gruner does have that acid. Like it's not as high as Riesling, but it's still a bright, tight wine. But because it has a little bit more of that mouth coating character, that's good for anything that has a little bit of fried food, aspect to it. So that would probably be my like off the cuff answer. I'm curious, Heather, what are you thinking?
I was actually going to go with a Hungarian dish that I love very much. Think of egg noodles with farm fresh that's dripped on top and then dotted with butter and pre-fried bacon, and then just done in the oven until it all kind of coats down and is delicious. And it's usually paired with a side of grilled pork or just pan-seared pork. And that would definitely be what I would love to have with this.
Yeah, there's an Austrian noodle dish, kind of, it's more from like the borderlands with Italy, so you're in that sort of like genre of the world, but it's like noodles, egg noodles, and cabbage and ham, with kind of like a sweet, almost like buttery sauce to it. And I could see this working with that too. That's a very autumnal winter dish.
Yeah.
Now, would you go like traditional egg noodle or like Spätzle egg noodles? Traditional
egg noodle in this instance. Yeah. But it's nice to talk about some of these pairings, because I feel like the Gruner often gets, especially in the US, I feel like ends up as like a winter, sorry, not winter, exact opposite, a summer wine, right? It's really tasty, really refreshing. And of course we want those wines in the summer, but it's always helpful and eye-opening, I think, to think about how these wines are year-round wines. And almost all wines are year-round wines in the end.
And this time of year too, a lot of the Austrian and Hungarians would be putting out, especially for their larger parties, something in Hungarian called Weickreme, but the Austrians would call them spreads. And they're usually a cheese or a sour cream and cheese base. They're relatively easy to make. You can find the recipes all over Pinterest and the internet. And this is something that would really go beautifully with that and warm bread.
I think a seasoned pork would go really well with Gruner.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And it does, it also has that little bit of smokiness to it, or what I'm calling smokiness, but like something that comes off the grill. I feel like also, you know, I feel like we don't think of white wines with grilled food as often as we should as well. And this is a prime example. I think with that, we will go to the last of the whites. And this is another, well, it's not a rarity because it's not sold out, but it is a new release. 21 KJR Chardonnay. Switch to a new wine is when my Wi-Fi decides to get wonky. This is a grape that needs no introduction, I suppose, but has been a bit of a stranger around Red Newt, because much like with the Gruner, where we really wanted to get a feel for it before we made one and released it, the Chardonnay, we didn't want to make a Chardonnay. There needed to be a real reason behind it, which is, I think, often how we operate. But if we're going to add something new to the program, there has to be a real compelling argument for it, other than people will buy it. So the Chard, similar to the Gruner, it kind of starts in the vineyard. The Chard's coming from if the Gruner is up above what we call the knoll, the Chardonnay is down just below the knoll. It's all on the same little rise of land, though. And it is a really ripe, beautiful site in every facet. And in a vintage like 2021, which was, shall we say, challenging to be pulled to it.
That's polite.
Yes, a vineyard site that's really great at draining water and helps things ripen is really exactly what you want to get through the disease pressure of a vintage like last year. So I'll do some of the boring stuff up front and talk about the winemaking. So grapefruit, we treated this in a very different way than a lot of our other white wines. And I feel like maybe some of the ways we've treated it speak to the fact that it's coming from a Riesling house, a Chard from a Riesling. But with Riesling, we normally crush the fruit and let it macerate for at least overnight, if not a few days. We went the opposite direction with this Chardonnay. We brought it in, we put it right into the press without crushing it, so about as gentle a handling as we could, and then pressed it overnight, which was, I'm trying to think, it's 1,000 minutes. See if I can do my math quickly here. It's like 14 hours, something like that. It's as long as the press will let us go, but really long, really slow press cycle to try and get something out of the skins, but still treating the fruit really gently. And then we did something which is maybe a little crazy. We didn't add sulfur at that point. Normally at juice stage, you add sulfur to protect it. You chill the juice down, again, to protect it, add sulfur, and then settle it and rack it, and then get it going. With this, we didn't we didn't cold settle it. We didn't settle it at all, actually. We kept, because we had treated it so gently, we knew we could carry all of the juice that came out of the press. And we knew that we also could get away without sulfuring it. And basically, if you don't sulfur a juice, it turns into cider, which sounds scary. But the enzyme that creates the browning mechanism falls out as a result. It kind of activates, it goes brown, and then it falls out of the juice. So in a weird way, if you go no sulfur up front, you're kind of helping build in some ageability to the wine, because that whole mechanism has been removed. Whereas if you add sulfur, you're constantly trying to fight against that. So we put it right into these very large, almost triple barrel size puncheons that we have, French oak. Did 3 different puncheons of it. Let it ferment spontaneously. As soon as it starts fermenting, the yeast immediately clean it up. It goes from looking like cider to being like a normal white ferment and eventually a normal white wine. Fermented in barrel. We didn't allow malolactic to happen. So we weren't looking for that like big buttery style of Chardonnay. We wanted it to be a little bit crisper, a little more mineral. At the end of fermentation, we added sulfur because we're not crazy people, and we did want to protect the wine at that point. And then it stayed in barrel until, Megs, you might have it at your fingertips. Was it like August when we racked it out and trying to?
Yeah, so that was racked out in late July, early August.
And then bottled up from there. So that's the sort of like long, boring, how did we make the wine, which is interesting to us because it's such a different thing for us to work on and a different style of winemaking. And I've been out in the market and had to talk about this ever since we released it a little bit. So I'm actually more interested. I'm going to kick it to Megs and see how does she describe this one, and others as well, but I'm going to make Meg stop first.
Oh, gee, thanks, Kelby. No, I think getting to work with the Chardonnay for me was actually pretty exciting because we hadn't worked with this grape. I personally had not worked with Chardonnay at a red meat cellar kind of standpoint ever in my career. I worked with it a little bit when I was in Australia. And when I was there, we actually did use 600-liter puncheons, much like we did at Red Newt, with varying age kind of barrels. And so I found that I preferred the ones that had been used for a couple of years, that I think spoke a little bit more to like the actual grapes kind of identity. So we I don't know. Let me back this up a little bit. When we talk about Chardonnay, a lot of people often think about like the oak kind of description that comes with it because they often are oaked and that's kind of the overriding capacity. But like the grape itself is absolutely stunning, like from, grape to juice, and then also like to final wine, like stainless steel versus an oak component, all really beautiful. So when we first went to put it in oak, I was a little bit hesitant, kind of like, oh, don't want it to kind of lose its identity as a grape, but the puncheons we were using were old enough and aged enough such that like the oak wasn't overriding anything. It was really kind of highlighting some of the fruitiness while also giving a little bit more of those fermentation kinetics that kind of happen, which give a little bit more roundness to it without kind of taking away from the acid. It's more about building in mouthfeel. So, kind of like working with this grape from beginning to end on a really challenging vintage, ended up being really rewarding, kind of seeing what Chardonnay can do, like how it doesn't have to be this low acid kind of blousy wine, that it actually can have structure and a little bit of like coating mouthfeel, but also still like holding up to its own and like expressing some of those really cool Chardonnay components that I don't think are often celebrated for the grape that can be.
Well, since this would be pre-Megs or Kelby, I'll ask Dave. Now, I remember that we had a Chardonnay Sauvignon Blanc blend a really, really long time ago. And then maybe a Chardonnay in 2009, like a super, super small amount of it. 2008, Megs? Okay, so Megs didn't work on it in the cellar, but she remembers it.
We made a Chardonnay when I think just one vintage. That's when Justin Boyette was with us back then. It was now founded Hector Wine Company, but he was at Red Newt for a vintage, or maybe two vintages. I can't remember. Yeah, a couple of vintages back then. That was before 2000s. Maybe we made one in 2008. He was there. He was with us back in 2006, I think. Anyway. Besides that, but we did make a Chardonnay and bottled a Chardonnay at least 1 year. We made a blend with Chardonnay Sauv Blanc for at least 1 year. And way back when we were buying Chardonnay and we were basically putting it, that was the primary grape in our Salamander White when we started that project. And this may sound really bizarre, but back in the early 2000s, there was kind of a glut of Chardonnay because it had become out of fashion, and some of our key growers had extra Chardonnay they didn't know what to do with. So I said, okay, well, we'll work with you and we'll make this kind of cool, dry white wine Chardonnay, a little bit of some other varieties. And we launched that product, and then within a year or two, Chardonnay became all of a sudden popular again. So we didn't have Chardonnay to put in there. So it's just a little.
So that was how Salamander White started.
That's why we made Salamander White, to help use the Chardonnay that our growers couldn't sell elsewhere. Back then, that's not the case anymore, but it was.
But we don't make it anymore.
That was back in ancient history of the Finger Lakes. That's the way it was for a while.
Ancient history.
Yeah, now it's almost inverted. Chard is in quite a bit of demand, especially good chard, I should say. That's the trick. But yeah, I think we've been really happy with this, and it's been fun seeing people get to try it. Like Meg said, the hope was that the sort of character of the chard would be what comes through. And to me, there's just this beautiful sort of like pineapple, peach, and I mean, sort of a lot of the classic like apple mineral sort of things with Chardonnay, but you can tell that there is a real ripeness to the vineyard site this comes from. And I'm continue to be glad that we didn't let it go through ML. I think that there's maybe that's the Riesling winemaker in me speaking, but there's a nice freshness to it as a result. And like Meg said, the barrel or the puncheons were aged, but in particular, what has been in them before was Riesling, and Riesling is far more extractive of oak aromatics than Chardonnay would be because of the acid functionally. So having Riesling in these puncheons for a few years before the chard went in means that the sort of, I don't know, licking a 2x4 potential was not something we had to worry about, which just is not what we were looking for, obviously.
So I think one of the things that strikes me the most about this Chardonnay, and of course I told you I was skeptical about it being a Chardonnay ages ago. And you remember me telling you this story 100 times over, Kelby, but one of my favorite Chardonnays of all time was in 1996 Wolf Blass out of Australia. And what I loved about it is exactly what I'm tasting in this glass. There was this beautiful preservation of the beautiful fruit that is Chardonnay, but so often just overlooked or ignored or over manipulated with real subtle hints of oak here. And this is about as close to that 1996 as I've ever had. I love it. And it's a very different segue from what we've seen produced recently here in the Finger Lakes.
It is a very different Chardonnay, but it is absolutely delicious.
Yeah, it's a grape that that I think can do, obviously I should say, can do well in the Finger Lakes, but it's it took us a few years to feel like we had a I don't know, an idea how we wanted to work with it. And even then you don't know until you actually take a crack at it and see how it's going to turn out. So we're happy with this. I think we're especially happy given, as we hinted at, 2021 was a really challenging vintage weather-wise. And to have something like this that can result from one of the harder vintages that we've ever seen speaks to, I would say, both the potential of the site and the grape, but also the winemaking idea that exists behind the wine. So a fun white out of the three whites to wrap up the white tasting with, and not a normal one for us. Like I said, this is brand. Has this been?
I've never tasted this wine before tonight.
Yeah, first of all.
That answers my questions then, yes.
Now, Kelby, I mean, just a real question for probably everybody who's now curious. Now that you've made a Gruner and a Chardonnay under this label, is there the desire to continue making this style?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but, right, it's one of those classic yes buts. And the but is that 2022 was such a incredibly light vintage that there wasn't fruit on the Gruner in 2022. The vines lived, but there was no fruit to be had on that small parcel. And the chard was not too far off from that. So unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of hurry up and wait after folks try this before we have another a round of it. But I think we're really happy with what we're seeing with these two. And so long as other people agree with that, then we'll continue to make them. And they're smaller production, but yeah, as Katie said, I was going to ask if this was released yet, and then Katie answered the question for me. So another fun one to what, until Friday to jump on and you can buy. Yeah.
Now, in all fairness, we don't have a lot of that here. Most of it is at the warehouse right now, which is typically where we hold things before they go out for distribution. There's kind of like a first come, first serve on this one. If for some reason y'all love this and sell us out of it, we'll get as much from the warehouse as we can for you, and I'll fulfill any other orders that I can.
Yeah, this is a really beautiful wine. And I love the crispness of fruit and the tightness of the aromatics. And Kelby, you had mentioned that it does not have any ML, kind of being a Riesling winemaker, kind of taking that tack. But that's highly unusual in most wine regions. What are there other regions in the world that might make Chardonnay without ML? Because as I think of it, I can't think of one.
Maybe Chablis to some extent,
Mhm.
I suppose. Like but I feel like it's, I don't know, you get the number of people who say they're trying to make a Chablis style Chardonnay dashed on the rocks of, Chablis is Chablis for a reason. It's in some ways kind of silly to say I'm trying to make Chablis when you can make a beautiful Finger Lake style. But yeah, I'd say the lack of ML is not particularly common. I feel like you're seeing more of it as a, like, this is like winemaking geekery, but like I feel like especially in California, you're seeing them block MLs because they're trying to retain acidity, and then blending that in with ML lots so that you have both a lot of ML character and a lot of, but still get some acid from somewhere that isn't always a bag. Yeah, this is not as common, and it is something that I feel like you see in the Finger Lakes more, and I shouldn't say more and more. There's been a good chunk of no ML Finger Lakes shards that can exist and can be. It's something that in the same way that I feel like as a region we're really good at rosé just naturally. This is, I think, a style of chard that is something we have a natural inclination towards.
Well, it's delicious.
And I think, speaking of natural inclinations, we will switch over to red for the final wine, the 2020 Cabernet Franc, another grape that the Finger Lakes can do in spades. I have become more and more aware of this, and it's like front of mind for me after doing a trip last month to Sweden, which has become an unexpectedly robust market for red newt. And I was bringing Cab Francs over and quickly realized that the biggest thing to do with the Cab Franc was to explain to people in a market what Finger Lakes Cab Franc is, because it's not at all what people expect given the grape name. I think it's what all of us kind of expect living or drinking Finger Lakes wines. But many people think of Cabernet Franc as, well, certainly in Europe, they think of it as Loire, right? The Loire Valley. So they think of this like usually very like green bell pepper, very vegetative expression of Cab Franc. And then oftentimes in the New World, people think of Cab Franc, if they think of Cab Franc, they're thinking West Coast US probably, they're thinking pretty jammy, pretty ripe expressions, but almost like Cab Sauv light. And in the Finger Lakes, and I would say up and down the East Coast to some extent, although I feel like the Finger Lakes is a really great spot for Cab Franc out of them. We have a different expression of Cab Franc. We're in regions where Cab Franc can come to ripeness, which is to say, not just sort of bell pepper notes, but so still some savoriness, but like the real fruit that we talk about with Cabernet Franc. That can happen here, but it can still happen with a red wine that's refreshing and is not 14.5, 15% alcohol, or that hasn't had the acid crash out. So this is something that I think is just a natural for the region in general. I feel like this particular bottling that we're trying tonight is one of my favorite ones that are labeled for Cab Franc. So this comes from the same vineyard site, Nut Road Vineyard, as the rosé. It's actually the exact same pick. You might have heard this spiel before. Same pick as the rosé, handled, at least for the first 3 days of its life, the same as the rosé, which is to say cold soaked. And from there, the parcels that are destined for rosé get pressed off and fermented for rosé. And then those that are meant for red wine get fermented on the skins, a la any typical red wine for us. So punched down by hand, small lots usually, although was this one 580s maybe, Megs?
This is actually a couple of 580s, and one of these was in the Eagle. So this was a pump over operation.
Yeah, pump over special. And then ferments after it's through fermentation. We age it a little bit on the skins, and then eventually basket press it off. I have a wooden basket press that is a real team effort to keep it up and running. Dave has lovingly remade wood staves for it. Megs keeps it painted. It's a real, it's an old piece of technology in some ways, but a beautiful one for red wine making. So pressed off through that, and then aged in generally old, I would just say like flat out old French oak. There is not really a desire for this wine to have oak aromatics or flavors of any sort. We want this to really purely be about the fruit source in the Cabernet Franc. But we do like the texture that we get from older oak barrels, the sort of, I don't know, mid-palate roundness that can come from that. So 2020, we talked about with the Gruner, beautiful vintage, riper vintage in general. That was in this wine. It's rosé as well. The rosé tends to be a real bookmark of vintage. I don't know, I'm blanking on the word I want, but the rosé kind of, people often ask if we've changed the style year to year, how we make it, and because there changes, and it has nothing to do with winemaking. The rosé's color change is just based on the character of the vintage. Hotter, drier vintages are darker. Cooler, wetter vintages are lighter, and that happens with the red as well. So this is a little bit, I would say, more like dark cherry red is a color, and is a little bit than other vintages of this wine, and is a real, I don't know, just such a great expression of Cab Franc. So I've spoken a lot again, so I'm going to kick it back to Megs to chime in for anything I've missed so far.
Yeah, well, I think something that maybe we haven't really touched on that I think is a really big component of what I think of as the KJR Cab Franc is the tannin structure. The tannin structure to me in the KJR Cab Francs in particular is always, it's very fine grained. It's a little bit more kind of mouth coating. They're smaller feel, which I really appreciate. I really think that it kind of speaks to the elegance. It kind of frames that style of fruit, which tends to be a little bit more elegant, a little bit more delicate than maybe some of our Glacier Ridge expressions. And I think, we work towards that with kind of the older oak expression, maybe the fermentation style, the cold soaking, which we also do the other stuff, but also vineyard side expression. We're really looking at what's happening with the same varietal of fruit coming from two different plots of land, a little bit of treatment, but also like what just happens, and then also being conscientious of that and how we react to it.
Yeah, Nut Road is a much cooler vineyard site. It's kind of the northwest side of Seneca Lake, just south of Geneva. So the opposite corner of Seneca Lake from Glacier Ridge and from where Red Newt is. So even in a riper vintage like 2020, the Cab Franc that comes from there is a little bit brighter in acid and structure. I feel like my go-to phrase when I'm out in talking about the KJR bottling in particular, because the Red Newt bottlings are, the Glacier Ridge bottling is frankly what like Bordeaux used to taste like before Bordeaux got kind of Californiaized. Glacier Ridge Cab Franc is smoky and like rich fruit, but still great structure and acid, and really, wants to kind of develop those leather and tobacco sort of aged characteristics. The red newt Cab Franc that also comes from down near the winery is just like explosive, sort of like berry fruit, I would say, bramble fruit. That's how it expresses its sort of Cab Francness. And the KJR, I always feel like, of the three, is the rarest of Cab Franc expressions in some ways, which is to say, I remember like getting into wine and reading all these, the books about wine and what the grapes taste like and what to look for. And everyone says, like, all the books say Cabernet Franc is did I just freeze on everyone? Oh, I'm back. Sorry, everyone. All the books say Cabernet Franc is like raspberry and violet, right? And which is just preposterous, because how often do you taste a Cabernet Franc that tastes like raspberries and violets? Like, that's like the least likely thing to find in Cabernet Franc at this point. But I feel like the combination of nut road and this winemaking usually expresses that side of Cab Franc. Not that you should find those two things precisely in this wine, but that's what it's nodding towards. Certainly in comparison to like the bell pepper side or the raisin side.
It has really good structure, and it's so smooth on the tongue.
Yeah, and that was that immediately exactly lines up with Meg's thoughts on it as well. It's really kind of the hallmark structure for this wine, that like there's structure there, but there's still like a softness to it or a silkiness to it. I'm curious with especially the others from, well, other than Meg's, the others from Red Newt, because this is a wine much, like I said, we have some rarities tonight. Most of this wine is in Norway. So again, I'm wearing the appropriate headgear once again. But so there's a little bit of it at the winery, and another one that's available through the Tadpole tasting packs here in clubs. But curious what folks are thinking of it, because it's not a much like the Chardonnay, probably not a wine that has been opened up or shown that much at Red Newt.
No, I'm not even sure that I got 2 bottles of this before it disappeared.
You can find more, Heather.
Okay.
This is delicious, and I really like it's very refreshing. And you were talking about raspberries and violet, and quite, this thing with Cabernet Franc in terms of its expression of fruit, and then you talk about, think about vegetal characters, bell pepper and all that kind of thing. And intuitively, one would think hot climate, fruit, cold climate, bell pepper. But quizzically, it's not that simple, because we definitely are a cool climate. But often in Cabernet Franc, in the vineyards that are well managed and grown well, we get explosive fruit, often cranberry, raspberry, this really beautiful explosive fruit, which then we have, given that, we have something to manage and sort of meld into a wine like this. And I think this is a beautiful example.
Yeah, Cab Franc is a real, there's various reasons for it, but I think suffice to say it is a bit of a flabbergasting grape for people. And it's the parent of Cabernet Sauvignon. It is just an amazing red grape to work with that is often misunderstood. But fortunately, people, I think, are becoming more aware of it and more attuned to it, especially, like I said, up and down the East Coast in a lot of ways, because it does well in Virginia and Pennsylvania. It does very well in Long Island. I think it does spectacularly in the Finger Lakes. And the nice thing of having it up and down this sort of very populated corridor is that, I can go to Washington, D.C. to sell wine, and elsewhere I have to explain what Cab Franc is, outside of, say, our sort of home region here. But I go to a city like Washington, D.C., and I'm like winding up with my spiel about Cab Franc, and people are like, "Oh yeah, I can't wait to try the Cab Franc." And I'm like, "Really? Where did you come from?" But so I think that's something that we can all be proud of, and it's such a expressive of comes from as well. Like there's just, this is the Nut Road version of it, but like obviously up Glacier Ridge, we have the classic label, and these are such radically different wines. And there's really not anything all that interesting. There's not anything hugely interesting different in the winemaking between the three. Like the real difference is the vineyard site and what that means for harvest dates, and maybe a little bit how we handle it, but not all that much. It's much more Cab Franc just being a great fit for the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, I think this is actually kind of a good segue point to kind of discuss that Kelby has often phrased this before, is that we are not in winemaking to force a wine into a style. We're more shepherds to kind of guide them into the wines that they want to be. So when we talk about like, oh, it's kind of this style, it's that style, it's been experience of working with those vineyards, working with that fruit, and kind of seeing what it is, how it expresses itself over time, and kind of reacting to that and guiding it in different directions. But it's really more about like what fruit's coming in, how we're reacting to it, as far as like, okay, it kind of wants this, maybe it wants that, but ultimately the fruit is going to tell you what it's going to end up being, and you help it get there in a healthy, happy way. But in the end, listening to what's happening, from the fruit and the fermentations is a bigger component than, kind of being like, you need to be a big bold red, or you need to be a sleek, dry Riesling. Sure, maybe that's not what we envisioned for them when they came into the cellar, but helping them become what they are is 90% of what we do.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. And really kind of a good note to wrap up on in general. I'll kick it back to Katie and Heather. I know I don't want to kick it to Katie with her voice.
No, sorry.
Yeah, but
But we do have a couple of housekeeping things. So these wines, like we talked about, will be available until Friday on our website. If anyone has any trouble with them, please feel free to just shoot me an email. I can take care of everything for you on the back end. I'll also send you a link tomorrow with directly to the Kelby James Russell wines on our website. In addition to that, we are offering y'all a special. You'll need to use a promo code, which I'll send you, but is Tadpole 2022. And that is going to offer you free shipping on 6 bottles or more. Shipping costs have gone up pretty significantly for us with UPS prices increasing. So we're not offering this to everyone, so you won't see this on our website anywhere. So you need to remember the promo code Tadpole 2022 in order to get the free shipping on the 6 bottles. And again, I'll send that in the link tomorrow to you as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you, Kelby, Megs, and David. We really appreciate it.
And thank you very much. This was our first time and it was a great experience. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
And some great wine. So really happy. Thank you. Have a happy holiday, everybody.
Happy holidays
Happy
to all of
holidays.
you as well. Thank you so much.
Super
Great
still-
wine. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have good holidays.
Thanks, Joan.
Good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
It's getting worse.
It
Bye.
is getting worse. Poor Katie. Drink more wine. Forget the coffee. Just drink the wine. See you in the morning, Megs. Bye, Dave. Okay. Oh, right now I can see your face in the